guys, welcome to Relatable. Happy Thursday. So excited for you to listen to this conversation that I'm about to have with Dr. Christina Crenshaw of Baylor University, who is the latest target of a small but loud mob of cancelers who are trying to take her down and get her fired simply because she tweeted skepticism about Biden's executive order to expand Title IX so that boys will have access to girls' restrooms and locker rooms and sports teams. And she simply questioned the implications of that. And also, if the feelings and if the opposition of the majority of Americans even matters when it comes to policies like this and when it comes to this kind of activism. She's got a lot of insight for us, a lot of encouragement. As you can tell, it's a longer conversation because so much is packed in. But I know that you are going to leave this dialogue feeling edified and feeling challenged and feeling built up. So I'm really excited to end the week with this conversation. Without further ado, here is Dr. Crenshaw. Dr. Crenshaw, thank you so much for joining me. Could you tell everyone who you are and what you do?
So thank you so much for having me. So I teach as a professor, technical lecturer at Baylor University. I have been in education for 20 years, taught as a high school English teacher, and then moved into the higher ed side. And I have taught as a professor out in California, and then we moved back to Waco, teach at Baylor. I have taught everything from educational leadership to social issues in education, most currently teaching a faith and writing class in the English department. And then I also teach an anti-human trafficking class through the Honors College.
Okay, gotcha. And you are here not just because you sound like an awesome professor, which I'm sure you could teach us a lot of things, considering everything that you have studied and taught over the years, but you're also here because you've gotten kind of unfortunately and unintentionally in the middle of some drama and maybe in some hot water with some students at Baylor because of something that you said on Twitter about the expansion of Title IX. So can you just give us a recap of what happened?
Sure. It was just a week ago, so still kind of reeling from it. But I would say it was a small group of students with a very loud voice.
Yeah.
And that is often the case. But because I want to accurately represent the student body, I have felt overwhelmingly supported by colleagues and students.
Yes.
So about 2 weeks ago, I would call him a like-minded colleague, Dan Darling, posted his own tweet that said, we need to be concerned as people of faith about the Mexico City cancellation with the executive orders by Biden and this Title IX expansion, that we should be concerned about this. And so then I replied and said, what about the rest of us? Do we have a voice on this? Essentially saying we are catering, we are appeasing the 1% really at the expense of the 99, the rest.
Yeah.
And that isn't to, imply that everybody shouldn't be protected. But my concerns, what I was really raising with just 140 characters is the idea that are we penalizing biological females at in order to cater to, again, to kind of acquiesce or appease, the small percentage who really want to occupy these spaces. And if you, kind of look at the language of the tweet, I use it in terms of children, because when I was tweeting, I was not thinking at all of my identity as a professor. I certainly have, a constitutional right as a professor to still have this opinion, but I'm looking at it through the lens of being a female, of being a mother, and anti-trafficking work that I do. I think that those are all places, this is a place of real concern. If we start allowing biological men, whatever their sexual identity, that is sort of like a nuanced and tangential conversation. If we allow biological men to have access to spaces historically reserved for biological women, we are going to have, it could be problematic. I think that there's enough data and enough reason to be concerned about that issue.
Yeah. And so you raised concerns about that. And I think everyone listening probably knows exactly what you mean by the Mexico City policy and the expansion of Title IX. But just to clarify, clarify for people who may not know, the Mexico City policy Biden reversed, and what that actually does is it sends our tax dollars to fund abortions worldwide. This has kind of gone back and forth between Republican and Democratic presidents. Republican presidents have said, yes, the Mexico City policy stands. Our tax dollars are not going to fund abortions worldwide. Democratic presidents, including Bill Clinton, Obama, and now Biden, have said, yeah, your tax dollars are going to fund abortion worldwide. Christians should obviously care about that. Those of us who are pro-life, and then the expansion of Title IX is talking about allowing boys who identify as girls into girls-exclusive spaces. So locker rooms, bathrooms, sports teams. And your tweet raised a concern about that, which I think is a totally legitimate question.
Yeah.
What about those of us who don't want our daughters to share a bathroom with a boy? Like, do we matter? Do our concerns care? Does our offense matter if we're offended by this, if we're worried about the safety of our kids, or just the fairness for competition for our girls? Why don't our voices have a say? And I think the fact that you got so much backlash for raising that concern shows that the opinion of some people, even if it's a minority of loud people, is that your voice and your opinion and your concerns, they don't matter at all. And not only that, but they're bigoted. Would you say that's an accurate assessment of the reaction that you've gotten from some?
Absolutely. Again, I would say, here's what I think is also really fascinating about this is I didn't realize how organized the backlash would be. So, a good week goes by and nobody really, people like the tweet or whatever, but there was not an immediate reaction to it, mostly because within my then small, it's tripled in size since then, small Twitter community, it is full of like-minded people. So I think it's, similar conversations that I have been having. But there is a group on campus who is working to become an organized, official, sanctioned group on campus that would support LGBTQ rights. So they would be part of the university campus recognized groups. And they've been on this mission for a while. I was a doctoral student there, and I remember, they were fighting for to be part of the university even then. And I'm not really privy to all of their conversations. I have not really been paying attention. I just know it's been at least, if not longer, a 10-year battle. And apparently there has been a very organized effort as of late to make this happen. So the Baylor Lariat, which is the student paper, ran an article recently, but before my tweet, really advocating for this group to become an officially recognized group. And this was just fodder for, I think, their agenda, because then from here they ran an entire student paper. It's not Baylor official, but it's on campus. A story about, and the title of it was Dr. Crenshaw, our Baylor lecturer tweets homophobic rhetoric. And so, it's even that language that was homophobic. I'm looking at our children and what this means for women. And suddenly this has this label on it that looks to shut down conversation, that looks to really label somebody, to pigeonhole them. It shuts down. It makes the conversation polarizing. And it's no longer a conversation. It's a label. And it's hate speech, which is part of, what they had called it. Yeah. So a petition gets started to get me fired. There's a whole change.org petition to get me fired. Finally, the university weighs in, and they do it in a very diplomatic way, which is to be expected. And they say, hey, this is the right to free speech. This wasn't hate speech. It's within the constitutional right. We need civil discourse. That then enrages the students, this small group on campus.
Yeah,
even
how many
more.
signatures were there at the time that Baylor responded?
Honest, Allie, I can't bring myself to look. So friends will screenshot colleagues are coming to my defense. They're like, did you see this comment? And I always thought it was odd when, people of notability, celebrities or politicians would say, I don't read the news on me. And I'm like, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. But
now you understand a little bit.
Like your soul can only take so much.
Totally.
So I would estimate that between, social media and my emails, and this is a fascinating case study, social media is where all of the hate speech is coming. Yeah. Nobody will write that in an email. Like, it's either overwhelmingly supportive or they'll say, hey, I support you, but maybe if you're going to raise this question, it just needs to be a little more sensitive. I'm like, fair, that's fair. But on social media, between the two, I've probably gotten 300 responses. If I had to quantify it, 75% is probably supportive, and then 25%, there were some who wished ill will to my children. And I, there was a day last week where every time a car would drive by the house, I'm like, wait.
You get nervous.
Yeah, I get nervous, which I've never, ever had a reason or struggle. But the amount of just hateful words, just venom that I think people would say. And I understand they believe they're fighting for justice with these words, is what I think it is. They're young, they're in college. This is their activism. I know. And I don't think that they realize that I have been doing this 2 decades longer, and that I have actual things that you can point to say this is what activism looks like. Even if you want to, I approach life through a Christian worldview lens. Everything I do is very gospel-centered. But I think even as an agnostic or an atheist or in a pluralistic society, you could look at that and say, she's doing really great work. And just because you disagree with this one tweet doesn't mean you have the liberty to paint her as transphobic. Yeah. So I think that has been the majority of the rebuttal to this situation. Yeah. What probably intensified it is, I don't know if you've noticed, but almost every Christian network picked it up.
All right, quick break from that conversation to tell you guys again about Annie's Kit Clubs. This is a subscription box for boys and girls that comes with a woodworking kit every month. So you get a new box every month with the new woodworking kit, and your child gets this kid-sized hammer, easy to follow instructions, and so they're able to create this awesome craft project with very little supervision, a very great alternative to maybe some of the other more digital electronic forms of entertainment that a lot of our kids use. This is a way for them to develop real life skills and to do something that is actually intellectually challenging rather than mind numbing. They also have Annie's Creative Girls Club, which is also a subscription box that comes every month. It sends 2 fun craft projects complete with easy to follow instructions. So like painting, beading, and things like that. Again, just a super cute and super sweet and super challenging way to keep our kids entertained. You can go to annieskitclubs.com/Allie. That's ALLIE. annieskitclubs.com/Allie and save 75% off your first shipment. That's annieskitclubs.com/Allie. Because I think it's because not that there's, this entire thousands and thousands of people mob that's coming after you. It might just be, and it typically is, a small minority of loud voices that are speaking up, but it's happening at a Christian university. You echoed a concern that a lot of very rational people have. People who believe, as you and I do, that we are called to love our neighbors and that we are called to treat people equally. We also believe that, we live in a pluralistic society where we have to balance rights and religious liberty and all that. So rational people, right? You and I, from my perspective anyway. But we have some concerns. Right. We have some concerns with the expansion of Title IX. We have some concerns for our girls, for kids. For what this means for safety and trafficking and all of that. And I think that's probably why it's caught on, because you said something in a very simple way that you probably, not that you did it thoughtlessly, but you probably didn't think that much about it before you said it.
I had no idea the firestorm it would cause. It was just a simple reply to a friend. Like, we were having a conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's why it's kind of picked up and it's become something, especially when there are students, even if they're just a few hundred or a few thousand students trying to get you fired. I mean, we say that we live in a society that has free speech, and technically that is true because we have a First Amendment. But I've talked a lot before that, you can have a First Amendment, but if the institutions and the people around you will not allow you to safely state your very rational opinions, then do you really have free speech? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't have a reason to really dig into my First Amendment right to tweet before. Mostly I'm a pretty, safe, centered person online. But also I just, I think we all assumed we lived under these rational, reasonable protections. But it turns out that there are actually, some criteria under this, and that I was within my First Amendment right. But you are protected to free speech if your speech is contributing to a concern in the public square. So essentially, if it's something on policy, if it's something socially, and if it's something within the local community. So if you are expressing concern, which I was, that's protected speech. You are also protected if your speech if you are not representing any official organization. So I could not say, on behalf of Baylor University, on behalf of my organization.
But you're not talking about what the First Amendment allows you to say. You're talking about
under the First Amendment, there are these employer rights.
Okay, so you're talking about under the umbrella of employer. You're not talking about in general as an individual, because obviously the right to free speech expands much farther than just genuine concern and things like that.
Correct. But if you are an employee and your employer wants to look into, investigate, potentially have some sort of, retribution for your actions, then the questions that they would look at, and there's been some cases who have gone, to the appellate courts on this, they look at, okay, is this person contributing to a conversation at large in the public square? Yes. Is this person representing the organization for which they work? No. I mean, perhaps, indirectly, but as I am not claiming to stand.
But this is the stance of Baylor.
Right. So this completely within my constitutional right to free speech on all levels. Right. So I think that that's where, if Baylor had to land on that. But it does raise concerns. I have gotten some requests to be parts of groups behind paywalls. And these are groups that I would never think did not feel comfortable speaking in public because they have very large public platforms. But I think this was really eye-opening experience to realize that people don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking freely, even if they can root their stance in data.
Oh, yeah.
I think a Cato study came out recently saying that 2/3 of Americans don't feel like they could share their opinion in public without some sort of backlash or persecution. Yeah. And now I don't know if I imagine the demographics were broad across the spectrum. I would like to think on the study. I haven't looked into it, but I do remember reading that and thinking, so that's people from both ends of the spectrum are feeling, if I lend my voice to any conversation in the public square, I could potentially be risking my livelihood, if not worse. Mm-hmm. And when I would hear studies like that prior, I would think, well, that's a little bit of a rash reaction, that surely we still live in an America where we can say things like, I disagree with Biden's 30 executive orders that he has signed within the last 10 days, without having to have a university that has historical Baptist tradition roots disagree and slander. And so I think that's what's been alarming for people to say, wait, if this Christian professor at a Christian university cannot even express Christian Orthodox traditional views without any sort of persecution or backlash, what does that mean for the rest of us? Mm-hmm. And I think that was really what was raised in all of these articles that have been written.
Right. And Baylor, though, they've done a pretty good job of making you feel supported. Is that true?
I would say that is true largely. I will go on record saying I have not personally heard from administration. I think that they're maybe just hoping it dissipates. But the provost, who is the second in command right under the president, did write a really great response about free speech. Civil Discourse brought up this example and said, this does not constitute hate speech. It is not grounds for reporting somebody to Title IX to question Title IX. And we're not going to fire her over this. And so it was a stance. Good. Yeah. Again, that just enraged the small group further because then they took their, backlash out on me. So.
Yes. And in my experience, it does typically dissipate. You'll get probably a trickle every now and then of people who will message you and things like that. But it is probably more encouraging than you realize for people to see someone like you raise a concern and, state something that so many people feel. And, we talked about a couple weeks ago, there was this baby sleep trainer. Her name is Cara Dumoplin, and it was found out that she donated to the Trump campaign. And, they tried to cancel her, put all of her paid for content for free online and all this terrible stuff. And, how she reacted to it was very kind, very gracious, and she didn't apologize. And that's the thing that I think people need to see is that if you say something that you really meant, and then the mob, even if it's a small mob, they come after you, they try to take you down, unless you really regret what you said, don't apologize. And I appreciate that you haven't. Yes, maybe you've taken some what you feel like is constructive criticism or whatever, but not apologizing, not then adding caveats, not then backing down. That actually gives people a lot of courage, don't you think?
Yeah, I have found that to be true. Well, one of the things I said to someone who reached out, they're, a really big Christian organization, and they had written about me. And he said, thank you for your bravery. And I said, just very honestly, I was like, well, bravery is hard. I mean, bravery, it's really difficult. It's not easy to be on this side. I can see why people would cater or why people would cave and retract a statement. I could understand that now. I haven't, and I stand by what I said. I will say it again. Biological males do not need to be in biological women's spaces. That really is not the best for the majority.
Yeah.
I'm putting it in very simple terms because it's hard to believe that is a polarizing statement in this day and age.
I know.
Right? I would say, my husband asked me the other day, he was like, if you could do it again, would you? And I'm like, gosh, it's such a hard answer.
I know.
A hard thing to answer. But I would say yes. I would maybe take off the cool at the end. I think that made it a little snarkier than I had intended, in the moment, again, just between, colleagues or small little Twitter circle. But I think, otherwise, no. I feel comfortable with what I said. I stand by what I said. I don't apologize for what I said. And I'm sorry if it hurts a few people's feelings. I'm not looking to be cruel. I'm not looking to hate anybody. I am simply looking to protect the interest of everybody, but in this case, the majority. We have not stopped to consider how sometimes policies we make actually hurt more people than they help. And I'm just asking, can we ask the question about whether this is really a good idea, whether it is with funding overseas for abortion or whether it is allowing biological men to compete in sports or to participate in girls' clubs that have been exclusively for girls. We have to remember that Title IX, 1972, was really created to protect women, to create space for them to compete in education, for them to compete in sports, for them to have equal opportunity and equal access. And so this is the first time, really Obama administration that we see, he was the first one to include, rights of people who were not biologically of their gender that we've always defined it by. But I think when we look at what defines sex, that's also a conversation. I've had people who are not necessarily faith-based, but are scientists who are, biologists who work with anatomy, and they're like, This is really ridiculous for the sciences. Yeah. The hard sciences are having a hard time with this as well.
Definitely. And we've had some of those people on this podcast. There are a lot of people. It's interesting how this whole, not just cancel culture, but I would say how far leftism has moved to the left, how it has created strange bedfellows. Yeah. It has united people in common cause. I have conversations on this show with atheists about the dangers of critical race theory, agnostics about the dangers of, erasing women, radical feminists, they would call themselves, who disagree with the expansion of Title IX and Biden's executive order and the Bostock case, that apparently Biden's executive order was based upon. And so there's a lot of people, I would say the vast majority of people, when they really think about the issue, not just, well, do you believe transgender people have rights? Well, yeah, of course. I believe everyone has rights. But when you dig past it, well, do you think that men should be able to enter girls' spaces in prisons, in women's shelters, in locker rooms, in bathrooms, in girls' sports? Most people say, well, no, that's not fair. But I think when we've allowed kind of postmodernism and this post-truth world in which we live to infiltrate every area of our lives, then what is science? Right. What is biology? Right. What is gender?
It all becomes
what is sex?
Very relative.
It all becomes very arbitrary But the ironic thing in all of that is that in the midst of all of that relativism, are the people who carry that relativism are so dogmatic about being right.
Yes.
And you have just been on the bad end of that. Would you agree?
Right. And I think what I'm finding too is you really cannot enter any kind of a civil discourse or conversation with people who are dogmatic and hostile and refuse to have a conversation about it. You know, if they're not willing to be reasonable about it, if they're not willing to bring in any kind of facts or data, if it is completely what we call, you know, within writing pathos, you know, logos, pathos, ethos, if it's basically just a feelings-based emotional argument, then you can only take that conversation so far.
Yeah.
Because really, this is a conversation that requires that we look at the logos, the facts involved in this, the data. You know, do we really think this is in the best interest of everybody? And that isn't to say that we don't look to protect everybody and to extend rights, but perhaps that looks like single stall bathrooms. Or can I at least have a nuanced conversation about what this will mean when biological men want to compete in track and sports? Because we already have some examples, some case studies of when biological men have competed in women's sports as they identify as transgender. Then they obliterate the field. You know, they end up winning all of these competitions. And you have these women athletes who are saying, wait a second, this is not fair. This is not right. We have worked too hard to get here. You know, first and second wave feminists worked to establish equal space. And then we have these third and fourth waves coming in saying, well, anybody who wants to identify as a woman is welcome to join the table in the conversation. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of us left still, you know, saying, can I raise my hand and ask a few questions about this? Because it all feels very anti-woman, to be quite honest.
Okay, another break to tell you guys about Gabi Insurance. I've talked to you about Gabi before. They really are an awesome service. If you would like to keep $961 a year in your pocket, then you need to use Gabi. They make sure that you have the best coverage for the lowest price possible. All you have to do is you go to Gabi.com and you link your current insurance account, and in just minutes you'll be able to see quotes for the exact same coverage that you currently have, but for competitive prices. And if they can't come up with other options for you for, again, the same coverage for a better price, then you can just rest assured knowing that the coverage you have, you're getting at the best price possible. Like I mentioned earlier, Gabi customers save an average of $961 per year. That can make a big difference for you and your family, especially if you are trying to save money in these crazy times. Gabi Insurance is totally free. They don't collect your data. You're not going to get hit with spam calls or telemarketing emails or anything like that. They just want to help you save money on your insurance. So go to Gabi.com/relatable. That's GABI.com/relatable. And in just a few minutes, you will be able to see competitive quotes for car and home insurance to make sure that you are getting the best deal possible and saving as much money as possible. That's Gabi.com/relatable. Yes, it definitely does. I was just posting about on Instagram, I listen to, I'm pregnant, so I listen to some pregnancy podcasts, some birthing podcasts and things like that. And the insistence upon saying birthing people instead of women or pregnant women or moms, it really grinds my gears. And it's offensive to me. Or when I hear the term chest feeding or something like that, I'm like, this amazing miracle that I so uniquely get to experience. What a privilege it is that God gave women this amazing ability to be able to birth life and then sustain life. You're saying that has that's not unique? Like that's not a special characteristic that God gave me that I can't relish in the beauty and the uniqueness of being a woman through birth, that I have to say, no, this just applies to all people. I'm offended by that. And kind of going back to your original tweet that got some people mad, does my offense not matter?
Right.
Like,
can I be offended that you're offended, or does it not work that way?
Yeah. So I can't be offended. So the vast majority of people who give birth, I mean, they're all women, but the vast majority of us identify as women. And you calling that into question, it offends me. It bothers me. It feels like women are being erased.
Right.
And so we've gotten so far, like you said, in women's rights. And I don't consider myself a feminist. I don't agree with a lot of the so-called logic of feminism. I think it helped get us here. But we have gotten so far in so many ways for women's rights, only for me to not be able to say like that women have unique capabilities. It all just seems so counterproductive.
Well, and it all seems it's all very circular. And I think to your question earlier, I mean, if your listeners want to do a deep dive into critical theory, because that is where critical race theory stems. We do that
a lot on our podcast.
Well, and I did a podcast through actually our church. We did one, it has a podcast, and we did one on critical theory and the dangers of it. And really this idea of deconstructing, you know, like specifically with theology, deconstructing 2,000 years of church history in order to fit into your postmodern secular humanist narrative. Yeah. Like that just seems ridiculous. Like
there's a lot of hubris involved in that.
Right. The amount of like hermeneutical gymnastics you have to go through in order to make something fit your postmodern narrative it's exhausting and it's embarrassing. And I don't think that they see the circular thinking within it, you know, like, oh, I'm offended, but you don't get to be offended. Okay, got it. You know, and I think also the irony. So for example, within the slanderous article that the Baylor student paper wrote, a former student of mine said essentially like, I really like Dr. Crenshaw. She was on our safe list for the LGBTQ community. So I was on her safe list on Monday, but then they had to like take me off on Tuesday. And I'm like, nothing about me has changed. Unsafe. Right. You know, so whatever it was about the way that I taught, or, you know, like my life is a pretty open book. You can go to my website. You can see I'm, you know, overtly faith-based. You know, I've associated with a lot of faith-based things. If that made you feel safe on Monday, but then I tweet something on Tuesday and suddenly it negates the whole of everything else that I stand for, that is on you, not on me. Right. You know, so I think that has been really interesting too, is to see all the logical fallacies within this progressive thinking that says you have to wholesale accept our narrative, or you were either with us or against us. Yeah. You know, and it's disheartening. But I think before it felt more like theory, and to actually live through it, and you're like, no, really, I do think that we need to be concerned about free speech, even if you run in, you know, Christian circles. I think that you need to be concerned about, you know, your right to express orthodox traditional views, because there are going to be people who question that. I think that we also need to be concerned about how much of a voice we give to youth. You know, I have said often before on social media, yes, all voices matter, but not all voices carry the same weight. Yeah,
definitely.
You know, look to the experts.
Kind of goes back to the ethos, pathos, logos. Yeah. You have to have, I mean, obviously appeal to authority can be a logical fallacy, but knowing where something is coming from and if that person has any significance totally matters.
I would go to Dr. Fauci to get my epidemiology, but I go to
a lot of people listening to this podcast would disagree with that.
Okay, compared to for my theology, I would go to Dr. Timothy Keller, right? Like I don't, you know, you go to the expert in the field. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with everything Fauci says. So I'm saying you don't take advice exclusively from
Timothy
the
Keller.
internet.
There's going to be people who also don't agree with Timothy Keller on everything. So just
in general,
people can disagree on all that. That's perfectly fine. But yes, they are experts, and you wouldn't go to Dr. Fauci for theology.
Exactly. Or Keller for epidemiology, right? Like you go to the people who have done the hard work in this field. And that is, you know, really my point there. So wherever you land, if you know, Gospel Coalition or whatever, you know, like, is where you go for your source. But the point is, go to people who do this for a living. Don't just take advice from groups on the internet. You know, like you have to go to people who have the clout and credibility is where I'm coming from in that. And so I think that has been interesting because we live now in this world, the last 10, no more than 15 years, where everybody has a voice and everybody has a seat at the table. And we want to, you know, hear every voice, and every voice counts. And I think that we're starting to realize there's a danger in that is not the most reasonable and then the best interest of everybody to allow so many voices to be present at the table. Yeah. So, yeah.
And you have to look at actually how many voices are there? There was someone who I've had on this podcast, Abigail Schreier, who she wrote the book Irreversible Damage, and she talks about she talks about this subject, about how there's actually a social contagion involved with these teenage girls suddenly saying that they identify as the other gender. Some of them go through surgery or procedures and they regret it. So she's written a book about that. She's really been a champion of that issue of advocating for these young girls who are kind of being tossed aside by the medical community and just given hormones and forgotten about. But one person, random person on Twitter complained about Target selling her book. One person. Random, again, like, I don't know how many followers they had, but it wasn't some journalist or activist or anything. Target immediately responded, took her book out of distribution. Now, thankfully, she noticed this, and the rest of us, this is what it always is. The rest, conservative Twitter got loud, started writing stories about it, interviews on it, and they put it back on distribution. But it seems like just one tiny voice of opposition, when it comes from the left, is enough to make major corporations and sometimes universities cower in fear and kowtow for no reason. I just think it would make such a statement if more people did what you said and said, okay, do I need to respond to this? Where is this coming from? Is this just one random troll that is angry? Okay, that's not worth responding to. It's when the universities respond, or when the corporations respond, and when they kowtow to these demands that it becomes this whole big thing. Just say no. To petulant children.
And I think there's only a few examples that I can point to where I have seen corporations stand up to an angry mob. I remember this summer hearing a story about there was a group, some probably change petition online to get Trader Joe's to cancel.
That's what I was thinking about.
Some of their items. And Trader Joe's is like, we don't listen just to the views of a few. Like, we make corporate decisions within corporate, and we feel fine with these names. We are not going to change them because you woke up today and chose to be offended by this. That is not how it works. And, and that's really interesting, too, because when a student reached out and was like, we're reporting you to Title IX, I got to tell you, Allie, my first thought was actually not fear, because I went to that place in my mind. I was like, okay, probably Baylor's going to get this and think this is ridiculous. She is, a graduate of our school. She's won awards. She has a great teaching record. She really, at the end of the day, makes us look good. Like, this is what we want to be able to say our professors are doing. Great research, great work, and from a place of Christian mission. Check, check, check. But I thought to myself, okay, so Baylor gets this, what if they do decide to do an investigation? Because that's what they were trying to trigger. They were trying to initiate these students some sort of an investigation into this Twitter post. And I thought, okay, let's say I lose my job. Let's say I can never teach there again. I can't ever go to, A&M or UT or any other school. I'm blacklisted. I guess I just pivot and I do something else. I had to go there in my mind, which is really sad and disheartening. But I say that to give people courage, because I think these are places we have to think through, particularly as Christians, particularly as believers. We have to say, I'm going to count it all loss. What does that look like to count it as a loss? It is disheartening that I had to count faith as a loss within a faith-based circle. It really brings tears to my eyes to even think about that I, didn't feel completely protected and within tradition and orthodox and biblical perspective amongst this group of students. That loving my neighbor looks like loving my transgender neighbor, but it also looks like loving all of the women and all of the daughters and all of the people that I would be concerned with, when this Title IX policy is implemented or implemented back from the Biden administration, because Trump had rolled it back and then Biden just reinstated it, is essentially what happened. So I think that on this side, I would say coming out of this, that we have to count the cost. You have to be able to say, worst case scenario, what would my plan B be? Because I don't want to allow the world to negate what I know to be true about science, true about scripture, true about morality, all the things that we have historically said, this is a truism, and we have upheld it through the test of time. We can't just allow a postmodern narrative to obliterate that. There has to be space for a conversation and not just a cancellation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, just one more break for you guys to talk to you about a new sponsor, an awesome sponsor, and that is ScoreMaster. So the average American has 97 points that they can add to their credit score. 97 points is a lot. It can make a big difference, but they don't know how to actually get them, and ScoreMaster exists for that exact reason. It's not credit repair, it's credit science. It helps you get your points fast. The average ScoreMaster user adds 61 points in 20 days or less, and getting your plus points fast can save you a fortune before you apply for a loan or a credit card or to refinance your home or buy a car. It's also great for business owners who use their credit score to finance their business, or if you are a mortgage broker and you need to have an edge in helping your client get a better deal, then ScoreMaster can work really well for you. It shows you the score consequences of spending too much or of identity theft. No one else does what ScoreMaster does. It really is a unique service. So go to scoremaster.com/Allie, ALLIE, to see how many points you can add to your credit score and how fast. That is scoremaster.com/Allie. I like what you said about the importance of loving everyone, loving your transgender neighbor, loving all kinds of neighbors, but we cannot, not but to you, but to this idea of love that is projected on us or is dictated to us by the world. We don't get our definition of love from the world. So loving your transgender neighbor, your gay neighbor, whatever it looks like, doesn't mean to the Christian saying, yes, we agree with you on everything. We agree with how you live your life. That's not what God calls us to. We see a perfect depiction of love and truth in Jesus, that he never compromised in what is true, that he always relied on the truth of God's word and his mission from the Father, even while loving so radically and intentionally throughout his life. And that's what Christians are called to do too. I mean, Martin Luther said, truth at all costs, peace if possible.
Right.
And we're not to make peace with the world. James tells us that, enmity with the world is peace with God, and vice versa. Friendship with the world is enmity with God. And so I think that Christians also need to not lay down and be okay with it, but get used to the cancellation that's coming, because Jesus says that we're going to be canceled for saying things that to us are so obvious that, hey, boys and girls are different, and in some places they don't need to be sharing spaces. And hey, like, this is what we believe about life inside the womb. People want to make you feel like that's radical. People want to make you feel like that's fireable, like that's cancelable. In Matthew 10, Jesus says, well, don't fear the people that can hurt your body. Fear the God that can destroy both your body and your soul in hell. That's our response to cancel culture.
Yeah.
Is that there's nothing you can do to me that is worse or bigger than what God can do.
Right. And I think that would be, sort of my overall synopsis, that, my key takeaway lesson learned from this for everybody else, is that you really do have to go into a situation where you are speaking up for truth. Again, biblical truth, scientific truth, just things that we know to be little T truths and big T truths, and to say, okay, but I have to count the cost of standing up for this, because if I don't, then what is the legacy I am leaving for the generation behind me? I am constantly thinking that. If I acquiesce to a postmodern, secular, really relative narrative here, what damage am I doing to the gospel? What damage am I doing to my children who are coming up behind me, to my Christian witness, and to the precedents I am standing for them? And so I think that is, it's definitely true. It's a little disheartening, because I think we're all working as believers towards a place where we can engage our faith in the public square. And I have been a fierce advocate, whether I am doing that through anti-trafficking work, because I see redemption and restoration in that, whether I am joining, Christian women's leadership boards. I am doing that because I believe that the gospel is the answer to brokenness. And it sometimes looks like overtly Christian work, and sometimes it looks like common good work, right? But I am nervous for the first time after this experience, saying, wait, it is getting harder and hostile. When people have been warning me about this, I see it, I've experienced it. And this isn't coming from a state school. This is coming from in a school that associates and their rhetoric says that, they're unapologetically Christian, right? And so to the one side who is saying, well, being Christian looks like accepting everyone, being Christian looks like loving everyone. Being Christian does not necessarily mean look like acquiescing to everyone when you are having to acquiesce what God says to be true.
Right.
And I think that we are entering into this new era where we are going to have to navigate those nuanced conversations as believers with such care and caution. It doesn't mean that we shirk back, that we aren't bold about it, but I think that this is where culture may not be as much on our side as it has been historically.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that.
Absolutely.
Firsthand.
And that's scary for a lot of people. But we did an episode on cancel culture the other day and said so much of what you're saying now is one of the pieces of advice that I give to myself, that I give to everyone that's looking at this wave of hostility that they know and feel is coming, whether or not they've experienced the way that you have. To number one, count the cost. It's time for us to count the cost ahead of time. Don't wait until you've been canceled to count the cost. Decide now. Is it worth living for Christ?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say that means we have to agree on all things politically, but there are some basic things that to the Christian are not political. Gender is not political to the Christian. Abortion is not political to the Christian. These are theological issues primarily. And so it's time to count the cost. And then another thing that I think that I encourage people to do is that when they see someone like you or someone that they know we're just standing up for what is true, getting the brunt of this mob, to stand up with them, to be willing to share the arrows, be willing to share the heat. I think that's part of loving people as treating people as you want to be treated. I would want someone to stand up in my defense and say, hey, this person's character is not what you're saying it is. This person is not a hateful person just because you disagree with them. And you know what? I agree with them. I think if we had more people willing to publicly say, I know I'm going to get canceled. I've counted the cost and it's worth it. And when I see someone being unfairly maligned for something that I know is true and I agree with, I'm going to raise my hand. Even I could stay hidden for a really long time, but I'm going to raise my hand and say, you know what? I agree.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. Maybe we won't change culture. Maybe we won't change politics, but we'll at least be united under a banner of truth while all of this is happening.
Right. And I think, too, it's interesting because it actually, it brings tears to my eyes. I got teary-eyed when a student reached out and said, I just want you to know we have a group chat with 188 students in it and we're praying for you.
Aww.
I didn't even know you could put that many on the group chat.
Me neither.
But I just got really teary. It was a male student that I actually have never even taught.
Yeah.
And I think this has been a red letter moment for this micro example. I would love to believe is going to be true at the macro level, that when we face opposition, that like-minded people with similar values will rally around us and say, this is not okay. You don't get to cancel somebody because they have a dissenting opinion. And that is true of the right and the left. But I think that most of us would agree with the statement that we see it more strongly on the left. There was a study that came out of Harvard recently. I don't know if you've read this, not long ago, but within the last 2 years, that looked at cancel culture. And it found that both sides do it. But it indicated that the left does it more and that the consequences are more dire.
Yeah.
And and so I read that and I remember thinking, well, I can see that. But I think here, I really see that. It's very rare that I see conservatives trying to ruin someone's livelihood.
Right.
It happens. The incidences are much more rare.
And yeah, typically I see it with something like, hey, I'm going to boycott Netflix because they had cuties.
Exactly.
Which, we talked about that too, the distinction between saying, hey, I'm going to take my business elsewhere, which everyone is totally free to do on the left or the right. Fine, vote with your dollar. That's very different than saying, hey, this small business owner, this
one person,
we're going to take on this person who said something I don't like, or this florist who won't service a gay wedding because of her belief in, biblical traditional marriage. I'm going to ruin her life and I'm going to go after her in court. Those two things they have very different repercussions.
Right. Very different motives.
Yeah.
And very different repercussions. Yes.
Yeah.
And so I do think, so again, I see this happen on the right or the left. I see it happen more on the left. And I do see that the consequences are more dire. And there is actually a study that supports that. So we can point to some data there. But I think, that is the thing that I think as believers, we're going to say, this is a red letter moment for all of us. Micro example on what we need to do at the macro level. When we experience cancel culture, when, somebody is trying to negate our right to free speech, to ask valid questions in the public square, to say that we disagree, then we have to be able to rally like-minded believers to say, she's not alone. He's not alone. We're concerned too, and that's not okay. And I think that in a way that we have not historically had to, because we shared the majority belief. Yeah. I don't know in this culture. I don't know that we have the loudest voice. And that is the thing. I think that we have the shared majority values across the spectrum of Christendom and people who, believe in Christianity. But I don't know that we have the majority voice anymore. And so it is going to take a rallying of people who say, hey, that's not okay. Yeah. And you cannot just bully somebody into submission.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I think the refusal to be bullied into submission also is, both of those things play together. Other people encouraging you and saying, hey, don't be bullied. Hey, everyone else don't bully her. And also that person, hey, I'm not going to be bullied. And I actually think there's a lot of encouragement. I remember a pastor a few years ago saying something that's just always stuck with me and has just become more and more significant as the years go on. And as I hear about different situations like this, is that the church actually thrives on the margins. So the church is in America being pushed out of the mainstream into the margins. And the way that that's happening right now is it's being really just evangelicalism in general is being conflated with things that it is not. White nationalism, white supremacy, hatred, bigotry, being told that it's dangerous, that it's inciting violence and domestic terrorism, that it's a threat to national security. And so, of course, any kind of speech that is even similar to any kind of traditional conservative Christianity, whether or not that person's a Republican, whatever, is going to be pushed to the margins. And that's scary for a lot of people because we have had this exceptional respite from religious persecution as Christians in the West, and in particular as Americans. But it's the rule, not the exception, that the church has been persecuted. And Jesus promises us that the gates of hell are not going to prevail against the church. That includes true believers in America. So yes, there's going to be pruning to the vine. Yes, there's going to be people that we thought were believers that at the slightest bit of pressure fall away. Yes, there's going to be compromisers who then come back and repent. And we might be pushed to the margins to where we don't have the cultural megaphones anymore, to where everyone's called a bigot and a racist for believing that the Bible is the word of God, whatever it is. But the church doesn't die on the margins. The church thrives on the margins. The church is not destroyed by fire. It's refined by fire.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
In all of these instances that you might feel, maybe you feel like this is so small that you just said a tweet that wasn't even necessarily theological.
Yeah.
And, it's not going to it might not go to Fox News. It might not certainly not going to go to CNN. It might not be this viral story. This small instance actually does matter. It actually does matter. And people listening to this conversation, it actually does matter. It is just another fortification of people's spirit to say, you know what? I am going to count the cost. And it is worth saying this thing that people think is controversial. Do you have any just last words of wisdom or encouragement for people who are facing, the same kind of anxiety that a lot of people are feeling right now with our views?
Yeah, I would say take heart in knowing that even if you feel that the church is being pushed to the margins and not really welcomed, in public spaces, that there are still, people who are willing to stand for truth, and you're not alone. I would say, too, take comfort knowing that the global church is growing. The global church, I think more than ever, the last few years have made me look to what is God doing globally. Sometimes I can become a little, ethnocentric, just what's going on in the American church. And I forget I have brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world. And
we're facing far greater persecution than Americans ever have.
Right. I might, I could have lost my job as a professor or been canceled at universities. I wasn't, thankfully. But there are people being persecuted in prisons for their faith. The underground church in China, there are places, where people do not feel like in the Middle East that they can profess to be a Christian. And so I think you're not alone in your persecution, but you're not alone in your hope either. For 2,000 years, the church has been growing and it has withstood the test of time, and it will. And so I think that's where my hope is. I know that that the Lord is never ending, that his promises are true, and that I can rest in that. I can trust in that. I can trust that, those promises are going to come to fruition, even if I don't see it in the moment. Those are going to come to fruition. And I would say the last thing, a litmus test for me, because sometimes people don't know, well, what voice do I trust? Who do I listen to? These are my quick litmus test for people. I would say I ask myself, would I trust this person to raise my children? Would I trust this narrative to raise my children? As I'm listening to, particularly I am trying to find voices for racial reconciliation within the church, because I want to find people who love Jesus and who are pointing me to truth, and to say, I trust the fruit in your life, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I see that in you, and I would trust you to raise my kids. And then I see these other hostile cancel culture narratives, and I think, I wouldn't trust you to babysit my kids. I don't want that anywhere near. So if you wouldn't let your kids touch it, you probably shouldn't touch it either. And then another thing I say is, okay, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Do I see this idea that the biblical narrative, creation, we're created in God's image. We've all experienced a fall. We all have a fallen, sinful nature, whatever that vice is. It needs to be redeemed and restored. And do I see redemption and restoration in this story, in this narrative, in this person? And if you cannot point to that, you probably ought to run from it.
Yes, and amen. And make sure that we are defining sin and wrong and right and good and bad and true and redemption and restoration and reconciliation in biblical terms, right, not in worldly terms. Yes. And thankfully, the Bible does give us the answer for so much. And if anyone is wondering, okay, wait, how is there a connection between talking about gender and, your faith and persecution and all of that? That's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast before. Biblical telos of gender is an episode that we did a few weeks ago that makes that connection, in case, anyone's new to the podcast and hasn't heard it. But I just want to thank you so much for all the encouragement that you've given us, for the insight that you've given us today. Is there any way for people to support you? Just pray for you? Can they reach out to you or what?
Yeah, so I've finally made my social media accounts public again. I had to go private in order to just protect myself from the onslaught, but you can follow me on Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter. I am not all that active. Maybe I will be now, but so you can find me on social media. I have a webpage. Would love to connect with anybody who is like-minded and, wants to establish a friendship in that. Love that.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Allie.